Well, just take a look at this 1980s beast, an Amstrad PCW 9512. It's a CPM machine, not my usual cup of tea, but these things seem to be falling into my lap at the moment. So I'm going to take a look at this one, maybe do a bit of a comparison between DOS and CPM, and have a think about what to do with it. So taking a whiz around the machine, we've got a floppy disk drive on the front, and that's a 3-inch floppy drive, not a 3.5-inch. And it's a built-in unit. The base unit and the monitor are kind of stuck together, and it's a monochrome paper white monitor. And round on the side, we've got some knobs for contrast and brightness. Not really much going on the far side of the machine. And on the back we've got the power button, some adjustments for horizontal and vertical sync. We've got a standard parallel printer port and a proprietary Amstrad printer port. There's some kind of mysterious edge connector here for expansion, so I'll have to look into that. And somebody's cut the power cable. Never a good thing. When they cut the power cable in an office environment, it usually means the machine's dead and they need the plug for something else. Amstrad introduced things at a super budget price. This one's a very business orientated machine, but they really shook up the market in Europe in the early days of computing and PCs in general, and they really should have been a bigger player. They made a few crucial mistakes along the way, but yeah, so this is just part of that history. So I guess the first thing we're going to need to do before we can do anything with this machine is repair this power plug, so we can actually plug it into the wall. So I'm just going to take another PC power cable, cut the end off it, and see if I can wire it in. So to begin with, before I open this thing up, I just quickly hooked it up using some cable connector, powered it on, and I got some action on the screen so that I know the CRT is working, and I just need to get inside and make a more permanent job of this. So it looks okay because I'm seeing some action on the screen, so that probably means the CRT is okay. I tried booting up using the CPM boot up disk, but I didn't know at the time, though I know now, that this is an 8 series disk, and 8 series disks will not work with 9 series machines. So I'm not surprised now, in hindsight, a few days later, that I didn't get this thing up and running using that disk, but at least there's life in the machine. Right, let's crack the thing open and see if we can make a more permanent job of this power cable repair. So pulling the back off, it looks like we've got a CRT at the top, what looks like a power supply below that on a kind of shelf, and then below that the motherboard, so it's kind of like a circuit board sandwich. So we need to get that power supply out and have a look at it and see if we can hook in a permanent cable. It took a bit of jiggling, but the thing came out in the end. It was like this old 1980s power supply didn't want to come out and meet the 21st century in person, but it probably just needs a bit of lubrication on the rails that hold it in place. So now that we've got it out, we can get the desolderer out, desolder those stubs from the old cut power supply, and just simply solder a new one in, and we should be good to go. And obviously it's just a word of warning that there are some high voltages involved when messing about with CRTs. Things need to be discharged and you need to be careful, so if you don't know what you're doing, probably best to check it out or get somebody who knows to help you. Okay, cool, so that's the power cable sorted out. Now we need to get the motherboard out. My suspicion is that the next thing is the floppy disk drive, so I'm going to get that out and have a look and see if there's anything going wrong with that, which is stopping us loading software. So below where the PSU was, we've got the motherboard, so that needs to come out to get to the floppy disk drive, and I also think that the CRT portion of this has to come off as well, which is a real pain in the ass. So basically you have to take the entire thing apart. You have to take the power supply out, you have to take the motherboard out, you have to remove the CRT screen on the front portion to get to the floppy drive, which is the most likely thing that you're going to need to get to, so it's pretty badly designed. Or should I say designed so that you have to pay a nice man from Amstrad a lot of money to do the job for you. So we've got the thing out and we can see the belt, and it's definitely snapped. So I took this thing apart, and I've never seen anything quite like this. This belt hadn't just snapped, it turned into like liquid gunk. So it was literally just melted goo on the flywheel of this drive. Nightmare to clean up, absolute nightmare to clean up. Eventually got it all off and got rid of the slimy stuff that was stuck on there. Got a new belt off eBay, so pop that on there, and then we can just give the case a bit of a clean while it's apart and put it back together and see what happens. Of course, one of the problems with having a machine like this where it's all very, very tightly sort of integrated is it's not exactly easy to put it on a bench and test things out. So I was trying to figure out ways of doing this and balancing things, but in the end I thought, screw it, I'm just going to put it back together and hope for the best. And for the moment of truth, no. Those 3 beeps, I looked those up, and that means it's a boot disk drive error. So it's not recognizing that there's a boot disk in the machine. So it still smells like a disk drive issue to me, but damn, I'm going to have to take it all apart again. Right, I took the thing apart again, and this time I reassembled it, but I left the floppy kind of dangling outside of its housing so they can actually see what's going on. And as you run the thing up, you can see the head isn't seeking properly, so I don't know whether there's some problem with the stepper motor or something like that. I kind of cleaned up the worm drive and tried to free it up and grease it up. I don't know if the stepper motor is misaligned or whatever. Either way, it's going to be a job in itself to try and troubleshoot this and fix it, and it's not something I plan to do right now because I don't know much about floppy drives and don't know how long it's going to take. So I think this particular machine might have to resort to Mr. Gotek. So the next step I think is going to be to forget about floppy drives for now and pop a Gotek in this. I've got a couple of them to hand, and I did order a 3D printed bracket because I did plan on putting one in, though I was hoping to have it in alongside the floppy drive rather than as a replacement. So I've got everything that I need. I think we'll try and put a Gotek in for now and just try and get it up and running using that. Freshly arrived from AliExpress, 2 Gotek drives. So here's the one that I'm going to use. It has a set of jumpers that you need to configure. I think this is to do with the file type that it reads, because obviously these things can deal with all sorts of different file formats for Amigas and PCs and God knows what else. And I managed to get the adapter off eBay correct for the PCW, so it's just a case of setting that jumper and plugging it in. Now these things do not come ready to use out of the box. It needs some firmware. The firmware is called Flash Floppy, and there's a couple of different models of Gotek. There's an older model and a newer model, and they have different chipsets, and there's different procedures for getting the firmware onto the drive. So I followed the guide for this particular model, which is the newer one, so it's a fairly painless process and it's well documented on the internet. So really, that's it. All there is to it, just a case of getting a disk image onto a USB stick, plugging it in, and we should be good to go. The adapter's keyed, so it's cool for connecting it to the ribbon cable in the machine, but it isn't keyed at the drive end, so you have to be careful to get the orientation correct there. So on here we've got the middle connector is for the drive A and the end one's for drive B, so we just hook it up to the middle connector and hook it up to the power. Moment of truth, let's power her up and see what happens. We've got the loading stripes coming down the screen, so looks like it's trying to do something. And then it stops and goes black, and I was kind of expecting this because I'd read on the forum somewhere that it doesn't recognise, I think it's that the drive is in ready mode or something along those lines, so simply pressing the eject button or one of the buttons on the Gotek sends that signal, and then it continues with its boot up. So not quite sure what's going on here. It looks like it recognises there's 2 disk drives installed, so it recognises it has another floppy, although that other floppy doesn't work. So this isn't the full boot I was expecting to see. I think probably the best thing is just to get that old drive out and get this new one in, and then we'll take it from there. So we need to open this Gotek up, because we only need the circuit board from within to attach to our 3D printed bracket. And also I'm going to do a bit of a mod to this. There's a whole bunch of mods you can do to these Goteks to add rotary dials and trackballs and all sorts of crazy stuff, but I'm just going to fit an OLED display to replace the 3-digit one, so it gives you some proper information on the OLED, like what version of flash floppy you have, what directory you're in, and what program you're looking at, and all that kind of thing. I wasn't best pleased with these brackets that I ordered on eBay. They were pretty crappily finished, so this is one that I'm not going to use. I've got another one that I've tried to finish it off a bit nicer and give it a little spray of beige paint to make it match, so we'll have a look at that later. On the OLED there's a space to fit a 4-pin header to make connections to, so I'm going to solder in those 4 pins and then just hook in some jumper cables that hook into the existing connector that was on the original 3-digit LED, so it should be a fairly straightforward thing. There might be a few sort of wires dangling around, but it shouldn't really make any difference. So the Gotek and flash floppy in general are extremely well documented on their GitHub page. So what I've done is printed off the section on mods here, so you can see all sorts of crazy mods we can do, but the one that we're interested in is the OLED, and it gives us the pinouts so that I know where to match up the connectors between the original cable and the new header that I've just put on. Get it hooked up, turn it on and see what happens. So yeah, cool. It's working straight away and it's telling us what version of flash floppy are installed on the Gotek. So just need to get the whole thing put together and then we can try it out with some software. Before I put it back together, I remembered that I had that problem with an incomplete boot before, so I'm going to load up the USB stick and run it with this OLED, so it might tell us some more information and see what happens. And yeah, look at that. We're getting a complete boot this time, which is what I expected to see, and we can see the complete file system and everything, so cool. So now it's just a case of getting this LED installed, OLED sorry, onto the Gotek and then putting the machine back together. So this is the other 3D faceplate that I got. I did actually get 2 from the people I ordered this from. Neither of them were very good. I think they knew that, which is why they sent me 2, even though I only paid for 1. So they both can be fixed with some filler. So what I've done with this second one is just give it a bit of a fill and a little bit of a sand and a bit of a spray. So it could be better, but it's good enough to live with. This thing has all of the holes in the correct places to align with the board, so it's a very easy job to screw it in to its place within the bracket, and then that just leaves the OLED screen. Now the hole for the OLED is cut to the correct size. There isn't any kind of fastening mechanism, so I think I'm just going to have to break out the hot glue gun, and we'll just run some hot glue around the outside of the OLED to hold it in place. And I'm so sick of taking this thing apart and putting it back together again, but hopefully this will be the last time. So everything goes back, the brackets, try and line up the new 3D printed bracket that fits quite nicely onto the original fastening posts for the floppy drive, only it uses 2 of the screws instead of 4, and then it's just a case of slotting the sandwich layers of the motherboard and the power supply back in, hooking up the CRT and then putting the case back together. And I would say that this thing is working again, which is awesome. So when I first got this, I was hoping CPM would be a bit more interesting because I thought it had a much tighter relationship to DOS than it actually transpires it did. So I was expecting to be able to do a direct comparison between the two and see some very fishy similarities, but it isn't really like that. Well, especially because you need to go back to DOS version 1.0 or 1.25 or something like that to be able to do a decent comparison, and it's quite difficult to get those early operating systems up and running on kind of modern machines and making disk images and stuff like that. It was all a bit tedious, so I kind of gave up on that idea quite quickly. It wasn't just that put me off as well. When I actually started really digging into this, it turns out that there isn't really that much of a story, and there isn't really much evidence that MS-DOS was directly related to CPM at all. And it turns out that Gary Kildall, who's the guy who formed a cool sounding company called Intergalactic Digital Research with his wife and created CPM in the 70s, chugged along quite nicely, and then got a visit from IBM in about 1980, I think. IBM were looking for an operating system for their 8080s, I think, and they went and spoke to Gary Kildall about CPM, but nothing came of that deal. Around about the same time, there was this other program called 86DOS, and that was being produced by a company called Seattle Computer Products, and the guy behind it was a guy called Tim Patterson. So this is where there's a few sort of accusations got thrown around. So Gary Kildall accused Tim Patterson, to the best of my knowledge, fairly low key, I don't think it ever went to court in a big way, but of ripping off CPM basically. But Gary Kildall, I think he kind of made some minor threats. Tim Patterson still has a blog online, and he says that if Gary Kildall had gone off in full full legal, that they would have probably capitulated, but because he didn't, they just stood their ground, because they said that they used the concept of the API from CPM for 86DOS and hadn't actually ripped off any code directly. So in their sort of eyes, they hadn't really done anything wrong. So IBM had a look at 86DOS, but it turned out it was actually Microsoft and Bill Gates who bought the rights to 86DOS. And then they leased that back out to Microsoft. And then I think the first version of DOS was IBM PC DOS, and that was version 1. But then, of course, Microsoft had the rights to do what they wanted with it as well. So while I think this is where the sort of problems maybe with IBM and Microsoft over providing operating systems potentially started to go sour, was Microsoft then started selling their own versions of DOS. So that you sort of had PC DOS and Microsoft DOS were issuing version 1s, version 2s, version 3s in parallel up to about version 5, I think it was. And then IBM changed a few things and went off on their own course and had their own versions of BASIC and things, so it was slightly different there on afterwards. Alas, Digital Research tried to compete in the real DOS world and just never made it. They made DR DOS or Digital Research DOS for a few years, but the cat was out of the bag and they'd lost the market. So getting out the instruction book for this PCW, it's clear to see when you flick through the syntax for CPM, there isn't really much in common with DOS. It looks the same as DOS 1 because when you boot into the screen and do a dir, which works for both of the machines, you get just a root directory because there's no concept of folders in either CPM or in MS-DOS or IBM DOS version 1. So now the system's up and running, the question is, what am I going to do with it? So this is my thought, because this is a specific office system, I'm going to use it for maintaining my retro collection. So I've got one of the spare rooms in my house is just full of all my crap, and I need to figure out how to catalogue it so I know where everything is and how much of everything I've got. So I'm going to try and get some database software or something along those lines, and I'm going to use this Amstrad to catalogue my retro collection and to keep tabs on what's coming in and what's going out and what I have in stock. Anyway, I thought that would be a really cool thing to do with this machine. Everybody has these machines, and they'll set up operating systems and they'll set up games and all that kind of crap on them. So to actually use the machine to maintain my hobby, I thought would be a really nice little new lease of life for this. And it's doing its kind of its original purpose, because these things weren't gaming machines. The PCW range was so widespread back in the 80s that they made a lot of games for these machines, surprisingly, even though they were all monochrome. But I don't think, for this one in particular, the 9512 is not well supported and well documented and all of that kind of thing for software. The earlier models, the 8 series, have a plethora of stuff, but there's slight incompatibilities between them, and these machines hold BIOS on the discs, I believe, rather than in any chips anywhere on. So you can't just take a disc from the old series and plug it into the new series, and the drives are all subtly different and get the power from different places. It's all a complete proprietary nightmare. Amstrad made cheap machines by condensing all of their sort of equipment, but made them absolute pain in the arse to do anything other than the simple thing that they were intended to do. But that's what we're going to use this machine for. So we'll be revisiting this at some point to maybe do a bit of database programming, have a look at some business software for a change instead of games, which would be quite cool. Anyway, I'm really pleased that this machine's up and running. I'm pleased with Gotek, and I'm going to try and get the daisy wheel printer that went with it at some point very soon. And I think we'll be revisiting this machine fairly soon, because my gaming room is a tip and my storeroom is a tip, so I need to sort them out. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed watching this. I hope you enjoyed seeing this machine come back to life, and if you did, I hope you consider giving me a thumbs up, leaving a comment or subscribing, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.